The sun was high in the Arizona sky, beating down on the dry, dusty plains where the earth cracked under the heat. The wind carried the smell of sage and sun-baked soil, twisting and turning in small gusts that danced over the rocks and sparse grass. Out in the open land, far from any town or road, a lone cowboy rode his horse slowly along the edge of his cattle ranch. His name was Jack, a man used to long days in the sun, caring for his herd, repairing fences, and handling the occasional trouble that came with life on the rugged frontier. Jack was tall, with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused from years of hard work. He wore a worn hat tilted low to shade his eyes, a leather vest over his shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles of dusty trails. Jack had always considered himself confident, maybe even a little fearless. He had grown up in these lands, learning the ways of the cattle and the horses, learning to read the wind and the clouds for signs of weather, and learning to handle the people and situations that crossed his path. But he was also aware that these lands were steeped in history, lands that had been home to Native Americans long before cowboys and settlers arrived. He had heard the stories about the Apache people, their bravery, their skills in survival, and the respect they commanded in these parts. Yet, Jack thought of himself as a man who could face any challenge. On that particular day, Jack was inspecting his cattle, checking to make sure none of them had wandered off or fallen prey to predators. The landscape stretched endlessly around him, hills rising and falling in waves of brown and gold. The sun reflected off the dry grass, making the horizon shimmer. As Jack rode along, he noticed movement on one of the distant hills. At first, it seemed like a trick of the heat, but as he focused, he saw a lone figure moving steadily across the rocks. The figure was an old man, walking with a cane in one hand and moving with a surprising grace. His clothes were simple, traditional, blending with the earthy colors of the land. His face was lined with wrinkles, each one a story of years lived, battles fought, and wisdom earned. This man was Red Hawk, an 85-year-old Apache whose reputation for courage and skill had spread across the region, though few had actually met him. Despite his age, there was a presence about him that could not be ignored. His eyes were sharp, dark, and clear, holding the knowledge of decades and the calmness of someone who had faced challenges most would never imagine. Jack felt a spark of curiosity mixed with a sense of challenge. Here was an elderly man, alone on the land. Yet there was something in his posture, the way he carried himself, that demanded attention. Jack slowed his horse and approached, wanting to see who this man was and, secretly, to test himself. He thought that maybe he could assert his presence, show strength, and perhaps make the old man respect him, or at least be cautious around him. As he drew closer, Red Hawk noticed him immediately. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. He simply stood his ground, leaning slightly on his cane, and watched the cowboy approach. The air seemed to thicken with tension, though it was a quiet, almost respectful tension, not violent or aggressive. Jack could feel his own heartbeat quicken as he got closer. He had faced difficult situations before, but there was something different here. The old man's calm, unwavering gaze was unlike anything Jack had encountered. "Good afternoon," Jack called out, his voice carrying across the dry air. "Nice day for a ride, isn't it?" Red Hawk tilted his head slightly, acknowledging him, but said nothing at first. His silence was deliberate, a measure of his understanding that not all situations required words. Jack's curiosity grew. He nudged his horse closer, trying to read the old man's expression, searching for weakness or fear that he could exploit. But there was none. Instead, he found strength, patience, and a quiet authority that was almost intimidating. Jack cleared his throat and continued, "I don't mean to bother you, sir, but this land, it's mine, or at least the cattle are. You're a long way from town." Red Hawk finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, carrying the weight of experience. "The land is old, cowboy. It has seen more years than either of us can count. We walk here not because we own it, but because it is our path. Be careful with words. They can carry more weight than a gun." Jack blinked. He had expected to see fear, respect perhaps, but not words like these. The calmness in Red Hawk's tone suggested wisdom and history, not a challenge. Yet, Jack felt a mix of caution and pride rise in him. He wasn't used to being unsettled, and this man, old as he was, unsettled him deeply. The two men stood there, watching each other across the sun-baked earth. Jack shifted in his saddle, realizing that brute force or arrogance would not work here. Red Hawk had lived through times Jack could hardly imagine, surviving hardships, conflict, and the changing world around him. He carried himself with dignity, not demanding respect, yet radiating it effortlessly. For a moment, Jack considered turning back, retreating to his comfort zone of fences, cattle, and solitude. But curiosity, pride, and a desire to understand the old man kept him rooted. He decided to test the waters carefully, speaking again but with more humility than before. "I didn't mean to offend. I've heard stories about the Apache people around here. You're known for wisdom and strength." Red Hawk's eyes softened just slightly, but he did not smile. He nodded once. "Stories are easy to tell, young man. Experience is harder to live. Words can exaggerate, but life does not. Be mindful of that." Jack felt the weight of those words settle over him. The wind whispered through the sparse trees, and the sun shone brighter on the rugged terrain. In that quiet, tense moment, Jack realized that this encounter was unlike any he had faced. He was dealing not with a simple old man, but with someone whose life had been shaped by survival, by understanding the land, and by the strength of his people. For the next several minutes, the two men exchanged few words. Each watched the other carefully, learning through observation. Jack noticed the way Red Hawk's hands gripped the cane, steady and deliberate, the way his eyes scanned the land, noting every detail. There was no rush, no need to act hastily. Red Hawk's presence alone commanded attention, and Jack found himself growing more cautious, more aware of his own actions. The sun continued its climb, and the heat became more intense. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and considered the cowboy's instinct to confront, to dominate. But here, it was unnecessary. Red Hawk did not react to threats with aggression. He relied on patience, wisdom, and an unspoken understanding of the balance between people and land. Jack realized that this encounter was teaching him something far greater than any fight or argument could: respect, humility, and the quiet power that comes with a life fully lived. As the minutes passed, Jack felt an odd mix of emotions: curiosity, respect, unease, and admiration. He began to see the old man not as a challenge to overcome, but as a teacher of sorts. The land, the sun, the wind, and the silent gaze of Red Hawk all combined to create a moment that was profound in its simplicity. Jack's mind, used to calculating advantage and asserting dominance, had to pause and consider something more subtle: character, history, and the strength that comes from a lifetime of experience. When Jack finally nodded to Red Hawk, it was not with arrogance, but with acknowledgement. He had learned something in those brief moments: that age and experience could outmatch youth and confidence, that respect was earned not through force but through understanding, and that sometimes the most powerful people are those who act with patience rather than haste. Red Hawk, sensing the shift in the cowboy's demeanor, nodded slightly in return. The quiet tension began to ease, replaced by a mutual recognition of presence and strength. The land seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the rustling wind and distant birds marking the passing time. Jack sat in his saddle, realizing that what he had expected to be a simple confrontation had become a lesson in humility, respect, and human understanding. By the time Jack finally prepared to leave the hill, he was no longer the same man who had approached Red Hawk with curiosity and challenge. He had glimpsed a strength far greater than physical skill or bravado. He had witnessed wisdom, patience, and a connection to the land that transcended generations. And though he did not yet know it, this encounter would shape the events of the day to come, as the old Apache's family would soon arrive, bringing with them a legacy of courage, unity, and unspoken power that Jack would have to face with both respect and care. The sun moved higher, turning the plains into a shimmering sea of gold and brown. The heat pressed down, heavy and unrelenting. As Jack sat on his horse, feeling the leather saddle beneath him and the coarse reins in his hands, his mind replayed the encounter with Red Hawk again and again. Each time, he noticed new details: the calmness in the old Apache's eyes, the way he shifted his weight just slightly but always stayed steady, the faint rhythm in his breathing that seemed to match the wind itself. Jack had faced many men in his life, some stronger, some younger, some more aggressive. But never had he felt such quiet, unshakable authority in a person. Red Hawk, standing just a few dozen feet away, had not moved. He had leaned on his cane only slightly, letting his posture speak for him. Jack realized that the old man's stillness was not weakness, it was strength, the kind of strength that came from living a long life full of hardship, survival, and understanding. Jack shifted uneasily, aware that every movement he made was being observed. He had expected the old man to be frail or hesitant, but instead, he was calculating, aware, and in complete control of himself. The cowboy decided to speak again, but this time with a more careful tone. "I have to admit," he said, letting his voice carry across the dry land, "I didn't expect someone like you to be out here alone. Most people would have stayed closer to town. Or with family." Red Hawk's eyes flicked toward Jack, unblinking, and he nodded slowly. "The land does not belong only to those who are young, or to those who fear it. It belongs to those who respect it and understand it. I have walked these hills for more years than most can imagine, and I know its ways." Jack swallowed, feeling a sudden humility he wasn't used to. He had prided himself on his own knowledge of the land, his ability to handle cattle, horses, and even the occasional confrontation with people who didn't respect his ranch. But here, facing Red Hawk, he felt a strange mix of respect and unease. He realized that this man, though old, could see and understand things that he might never fully grasp. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Only the wind moved, rustling the sparse grass and carrying the distant sound of birds calling to one another. Jack could hear the occasional clink of his horse's hooves shifting on the rocky ground, but the silence between them was thick, almost palpable. It was the kind of silence that makes a person examine themselves, that makes them think about who they are and what they stand for. Jack decided to test the waters, trying to engage the old man in conversation without provoking him. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" he asked. "The land, people, the changes over the years?" Red Hawk's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing the question. Then he spoke, his voice low but clear, carrying authority. "I have seen the rivers dry, the rains come late, the herds wander, and the people forget lessons they should not. The land remembers what humans forget, and so do we." Jack nodded, though he didn't fully understand all the words. He felt their meaning in his bones, in the way the wind shifted over the plains and the sun burned on his back. Red Hawk wasn't just talking about the land, he was talking about life itself. There was a wisdom there that could not be rushed, could not be ignored, and could not be challenged lightly. Feeling a mix of admiration and nervousness, Jack shifted his position on the horse. He realized that for the first time in a long while, he was not the one in control. Red Hawk held that power. Not with weapons or threats, but with presence alone. Jack's pride, which had carried him through years of ranch work and small-town disputes, felt both challenged and humbled. He tried again, this time speaking more cautiously. "I've heard stories about you," he said, "about the things you've done, the people you've known. I didn't think the stories were true, but seeing you, I can feel there's something more there. Something real." Red Hawk's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time, there was a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Stories are words," he said. "Words can grow taller than truth. What is real is what we do, what we endure, and how we treat the land and each other. You have curiosity, cowboy. That is good. Curiosity is the beginning of learning." Jack felt a flicker of respect rise in him. He had not expected advice or wisdom from this encounter. He had come thinking it would be a simple test of presence, perhaps even a chance to assert himself. Instead, he was learning lessons he had never thought about: patience, humility, and the quiet strength of someone who had lived fully and survived against the odds. The minutes passed, and the sun climbed higher, turning the air into a haze of heat. Jack felt sweat running down his back and dripping into his eyes. But he hardly noticed. His attention was entirely on Red Hawk, on the way the old man moved, spoke, and observed the land. Each moment was a small revelation. Jack realized that confrontation alone could never measure a person's worth. Strength could come quietly, without a word, without a weapon, simply through presence and understanding. Red Hawk shifted slightly, his cane tapping gently against a rock, creating a soft, deliberate rhythm. It was as if he was marking time, letting Jack know that the world did not move as quickly as a cowboy's impatience might suggest. Jack felt his own pulse slow as he watched, realizing that he had been in a hurry, expecting results and answers too quickly. Here, he learned the power of waiting, of watching, of understanding before acting. Jack decided to make one last effort to bridge the gap between curiosity and respect. "I have to say," he admitted, "I didn't expect to meet anyone like you today. You've changed how I see this land. And maybe even myself." Red Hawk's eyes softened further, and he allowed a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Then perhaps this encounter is not about one man proving himself to another," he said. "Perhaps it is about understanding. Remember, cowboy, there is more to life than showing strength. There is wisdom in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to stand quietly." Jack's horse shifted beneath him, nudging him forward slightly, reminding him of the practical world beyond this moment. He realized he had been lost in thought, captivated by the presence of Red Hawk and the weight of his words. The cowboy felt a strange mix of admiration, humility, and determination. He knew he could not measure this man by the usual standards of courage or confrontation. Red Hawk was a living example of endurance, wisdom, and the respect earned through a lifetime of experience. As the sun continued to blaze overhead, Jack felt the encounter reaching a natural pause. He could sense that Red Hawk had no intention of leaving, no fear of him, and no need to prove anything. The cowboy understood, finally, that this was a man who had seen generations rise and fall. A man whose life had been shaped by challenges far greater than any he could imagine. And yet, despite the age and experience, there was a spark of life, a quiet readiness that suggested the old man was never truly vulnerable. For a final moment, the two men exchanged a look that conveyed more than words ever could. Jack saw in Red Hawk a lifetime of survival, respect for the land, and understanding of people that surpassed mere physical skill. Red Hawk saw in Jack a mix of curiosity, pride, and potential, a man who could learn if he was willing to listen. Then, slowly, Jack turned his horse, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over him. He knew this was only the beginning, that the events of the day were far from over. But he also knew that he had been taught an important lesson: that strength is not always visible, that wisdom often comes quietly, and that respect must be earned, not demanded. As Jack rode back toward his cattle, he glanced over his shoulder at Red Hawk, still standing alone on the hill. The old Apache's figure seemed small in the vastness of the plains, yet it radiated a presence that filled the space. Jack felt a deep respect growing inside him, mingled with a cautious awareness that the land and its people were far more complex than he had ever realized. The cowboy knew that this day, this encounter, would stay with him for the rest of his life. And though he could not yet see what would come next, he felt the quiet certainty that the story was only beginning, that the land, the old man, and the history of the Apache people would soon teach him lessons even greater than the ones he had already learned. The heat of the day pressed heavily over the plains, making the horizon shimmer with a golden haze. Jack sat on his horse, still thinking about his encounter with Red Hawk. Every detail of the old man's presence lingered in his mind: the calm in his eyes, the patience in his movements, the quiet strength that seemed to flow from him like an invisible force. Jack had come prepared to assert his own authority, to show courage and skill, but instead, he found himself humbled and cautious. The cowboy had begun to realize that Red Hawk was not just a man who had lived long. He was a man who had mastered life in ways that Jack could barely imagine. The land itself seemed to respect him, the wind shifting gently around him, the grasses swaying without disturbing his stance. Jack could feel the tension in his own body begin to ease, replaced by a mixture of admiration and unease. Suddenly, in the distance, a thin cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. At first, Jack thought it might be a tumbleweed blown by the wind. But then he noticed movement within the cloud. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that more people were coming. The figures grew larger as they rode closer, and Jack could make out the shapes of several men on horseback, riding with purpose and precision. Red Hawk's eyes, sharp despite his age, followed the approaching riders without a sign of surprise. He remained calm, standing tall with his cane in hand, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. The presence of one old man had already unsettled him, but now a group of riders was coming, and he had no idea what to expect. As the riders drew closer, Jack could see that they were not ordinary cowboys or townspeople. They were Apache, moving with a unity and discipline that was striking. At the front rode a man who could only be Red Hawk's son. He was in his 50s, tall and strong, with a presence that seemed to combine his father's wisdom with his own authority. His eyes were focused, and his posture exuded confidence and control. Jack recognized immediately that this man was a leader, someone who commanded respect not through words alone but through the weight of his being. The son, known as White Eagle, led a small but formidable clan. Each rider followed with precision, their movements synchronized like a single organism. Jack's pulse quickened as he realized the scale of what was happening. He had not come across a single old man. He was now facing an entire group of skilled, disciplined warriors. The wind carried the sound of hooves striking the dry earth, the rhythm steady and purposeful, echoing across the plains. Jack felt a mixture of awe and fear, understanding that any misstep now could have serious consequences. White Eagle's eyes scanned the surroundings as he rode forward, taking in Jack, his horse, and the land itself. There was no anger in his gaze, no rush to attack, but there was a clear understanding that he had the power to control the situation. Jack shifted in his saddle, realizing that he had underestimated the reach and influence of Red Hawk's family. The calm authority of the old man was amplified now by the presence of his son and clan, creating an atmosphere that was both intimidating and respectful. The riders approached to a distance where communication could occur, but still far enough to allow room for movement. Jack felt his hands tighten around the reins, feeling the leather bite into his palms. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that he had faced difficult situations before. But this was unlike anything he had encountered. The combination of age, wisdom, experience, and now family strength was overwhelming in its presence. White Eagle dismounted smoothly, his movements deliberate and controlled, demonstrating both skill and authority. His clan followed suit, creating a small circle of riders around the area where Jack and Red Hawk stood. The air seemed to grow heavier with anticipation, though there was no aggression. Only the quiet power of presence and unity. Jack could feel the weight of history and tradition pressing down, the unspoken understanding that these people had lived through challenges and conflicts far beyond his own experience. Jack swallowed, feeling both respect and caution rise within him. He understood that this was no longer a simple encounter. It was a test of character, patience, and judgment. The cowboy's usual methods, arrogance, quick action, or force would not work here. He needed to think carefully, observe, and respond with awareness rather than impulse. White Eagle stepped closer, his gaze steady on Jack. "I see you have met my father," he said, his voice calm but carrying authority. "You have been here a while. You understand then the meaning of respect?" Jack nodded, realizing that this was a question not about words, but about understanding and attitude. "Yes," he replied carefully. "I understand more than I did when I arrived. I see the strength, the history, and I respect it." White Eagle's eyes softened just slightly, acknowledging Jack's words. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the sound of horses shifting beneath their riders and the wind whispering through the sparse trees and grasses. The clan watched quietly, each rider holding a stance that combined readiness with calm, a balance of power and patience. Jack could feel the tension in the air begin to change. The immediate threat had not vanished, but it had transformed into something else. An opportunity to show understanding, humility, and respect. Red Hawk remained standing nearby, his cane steady, his posture unyielding. Though he was 85, he projected the same calm authority that had unsettled Jack earlier. The presence of his son and clan did not diminish his influence. If anything, it magnified it, showing that leadership and respect could extend across generations. Jack began to realize that he was witnessing something profound, a living demonstration of family, heritage, and the power of unity. White Eagle continued, his voice firm but measured. This land carries our history. My father has walked these hills for decades, and we continue that journey. Any who come here must recognize the respect owed to those who came before, and to those who remain. Jack nodded again, feeling the weight of the words and the presence behind them. He had entered this land with confidence, ready to assert himself. But he now understood that true strength was not measured by confrontation alone. It was measured by wisdom, patience, understanding, and the ability to recognize the presence of others. The Apache clan remained silent, their eyes alert, observing Jack without hostility. They were skilled, trained, and united. Yet their movements were calm, showing confidence without aggression. Jack realized that he was not facing enemies, but a family who had survived and thrived through knowledge, tradition, and respect for each other and their land. Jack's mind raced, thinking about his next move. He knew that any sudden action could be misinterpreted, yet inaction could show weakness. He shifted slightly in his saddle, letting his posture convey acknowledgement rather than challenge. He raised a hand slightly, not as a threat, but as a gesture of respect. White Eagle observed the gesture carefully, then nodded, signaling his approval to the clan. The tension in the air began to ease, replaced by a cautious understanding. Jack felt a mix of relief and continued awe. He had expected a simple confrontation with one old man, but he now realized that the strength of Red Hawk's family was far greater than he had imagined. The conversation that followed was quiet but meaningful. Jack spoke carefully, expressing respect for Red Hawk and acknowledging the presence and authority of White Eagle and the clan. He listened as the Apache men spoke of their land, their history, and the importance of respect, patience, and understanding. Every word carried weight. Every gesture had significance. And Jack absorbed it all, knowing that this encounter was teaching him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. The sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. Jack felt the heat, the dust, and the presence of history pressing in on him. Yet, amidst all of this, he found clarity. He realized that courage was not about confronting others or showing strength. It was about understanding, observing, and respecting forces greater than oneself. Red Hawk and his family embodied that understanding. By the time the sun began to descend toward the horizon, Jack had shifted from tension to cautious respect. He knew that he was part of a moment that was rare and powerful, a meeting of generations, cultures, and histories that transcended simple confrontation. The presence of White Eagle and his clan had shown him the depth of connection, unity, and authority that comes from living in harmony with the land and with one another. Jack looked at Red Hawk, standing strong and calm, and then at White Eagle and his clan. He understood that this encounter was not about conflict. It was about recognition, respect, and the understanding that some lessons could not be learned quickly. They had to be felt, observed, and absorbed. As the Apache clan prepared to move again, riding slowly across the hills and disappearing into the distance, Jack felt a mix of relief and admiration. He had faced a challenge unlike any other, and he had come away not with a sense of victory, but with understanding. The cowboy had learned that true strength is quiet, measured, and rooted in wisdom passed through generations. Jack's thoughts lingered on the encounter as he guided his horse back toward his cattle. He knew that he had been tested, not by aggression, but by the presence of those who carried history, respect, and authority with them. He would remember this day for the rest of his life, not for a fight, but for the lesson in humility, courage, and respect that Red Hawk and his family had shown him. The plains stretched endlessly before him, and Jack rode with a new understanding in his heart. The encounter had changed him, leaving him wiser and more aware of the forces, both visible and invisible, that shaped the land and the people who called it home. And though the clan had disappeared from sight, their presence remained in his mind, a reminder of strength, unity, and the power of respect. The sky began to soften as the sun started its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the plains. The heat of the day lingered, but a gentle breeze carried a sense of calm and stillness over the land. Jack rode slowly, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. He was still processing the extraordinary encounter with Red Hawk and the arrival of White Eagle and the clan. The lessons he had learned, the humility, patience, and respect, were still settling in his mind. But he knew there was more yet to unfold. As he guided his horse along a familiar trail toward his cattle, he sensed movement in the distance again. It was not the hurried gallop of someone in anger, or the casual pace of a traveler. It was deliberate, controlled, and purposeful. Jack's instincts, honed over years of ranching and handling unexpected situations, told him to pay attention. He tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then he saw them, Red Hawk, now joined once more by White Eagle and the rest of the clan, returning to his side. They had not left entirely. Instead, they moved strategically, observing Jack and the surrounding land. Their presence was quiet but unmistakably powerful. Jack felt a mixture of awe and respect, realizing that the moment was building towards something important. White Eagle approached Jack again, dismounting with the same fluid grace and authority he had shown before. The clan formed a protective circle around them, not menacing, but united and ready. Jack, feeling the full weight of their presence, understood that this was a moment of teaching, of guidance, rather than confrontation. The energy in the air was thick, but not hostile. It demanded attention, focus, and respect. Red Hawk, leaning on his cane but standing taller than ever in Jack's eyes, spoke first. "You have seen a part of our lives today, cowboy," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You have seen what it means to live in these lands with respect for history, family, and the earth itself. You have understood something important, but the day is not yet done." Jack nodded slowly. He realized that Red Hawk's words carried more meaning than a simple conversation. They were a reminder that every action, every word, and every thought carried weight. He had approached this land thinking he could assert his authority, but he now understood that the true power lay in wisdom, patience, and respect. White Eagle stepped closer, his eyes meeting Jack's with a steady, unwavering gaze. "My father has walked these hills for many years," he said. "He has lived through hardship, conflict, and change. We, his family, continue his ways. Today, you have learned to see the strength that comes not from force, but from presence, unity, and respect. That is the lesson we carry." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat, a combination of admiration and humility. He had expected a challenge, perhaps even a confrontation. But instead, he had received a profound lesson. He realized that the old stories he had heard about the Apache people were true in ways he had never fully appreciated. Their strength was not only in skill or courage, it was in wisdom, tradition, and the bonds of family that had endured for generations. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind carried the faint sound of distant birds, the rustle of dry grass, and the subtle movements of the horses. Jack could feel the tension that had built over the day finally beginning to release. The presence of Red Hawk and his family was no longer intimidating. It was instructive. He felt that he was being invited into a deeper understanding of life, one that required humility and awareness rather than action or dominance. Red Hawk shifted slightly, tapping his cane on a rock in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Strength without wisdom is like a river without banks," he said. "It can overflow and destroy." Wisdom without strength is like a tree without roots. It cannot stand. A life well lived finds balance between the two. Today, you have seen both. Jack absorbed the words, letting their meaning sink in. He understood that the old man was speaking not only to him, but about the lessons of generations. He thought about his own life, about the pride and confidence he had carried into the day, about the impatience he had sometimes shown, and about the need for understanding and respect in every encounter. White Eagle added, "The land is not ours alone. The people who came before us, and those who will come after, share it. We protect it. We respect it. And we teach those who are willing to learn. Today, you have shown that you are willing to learn. That is why we are here, not to punish, but to guide." Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude rise within him. He had entered this land, thinking it was a simple place for cattle and work, but he now saw it as a living lesson in history, family, and respect. The experience had changed him, and he knew it would continue to shape his actions and thoughts long after the day was over. The clan began to move slowly, signaling that their lesson was drawing to a close. Yet, their movements were deliberate and dignified, showing that the balance of respect and strength was still very much alive. Jack watched as they rode in unison, their presence commanding attention even without words. It was a demonstration of unity, tradition, and the power of family bonds. And Jack realized that he had witnessed something rare and profound. Red Hawk gave a final nod to Jack, his eyes reflecting both wisdom and pride. "Remember what you have seen today, cowboy. Respect is earned, strength is measured in patience, and life is understood through observation and learning. Walk carefully, speak wisely, and honor those who came before you." Jack lowered his gaze slightly, acknowledging the depth of the lesson. He had felt challenged, humbled, and awed. But he also felt enlightened. He realized that the confrontation he had anticipated was not what had happened. Instead, he had been taught a powerful truth about life, strength, and respect. White Eagle rode up one last time, his voice carrying over the wind. "Go forward with care, Jack. Share what you have learned. Teach others that courage is not always loud, and strength is not always physical. The lessons of the land, of family, and of history are there for those who seek them." Jack nodded again, his heart heavy with gratitude and understanding. He had come to the hills expecting a test of courage, but he had received a lesson in wisdom and life. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and gold. The land seemed to glow with a quiet reverence, reflecting the presence of those who had walked it for generations and those who would continue to do so. As the Apache clan rode back into the distance, disappearing over the hills, Jack remained for a moment longer, taking in the scene. He could feel the presence of Red Hawk and his family lingering, a reminder that lessons of respect and wisdom were not bound by age or number. They were carried in actions, in unity, and in the way people lived their lives. Jack guided his horse back toward his cattle, his mind full of thoughts and reflections. He thought about the pride he had carried into the day, about the humility he had learned, and about the strength that comes from understanding and respecting others. He realized that the encounter had changed him fundamentally. He would no longer approach situations with only confidence and bravado. He would consider wisdom, patience, and respect as equally important tools in life. By the time Jack reached his cattle, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the plains. He paused for a moment, watching the last light fade behind the distant hills. The day had been extraordinary, an encounter that had tested him in ways he could not have imagined, that had taught him lessons he would carry for a lifetime. He looked toward the hills where Red Hawk had stood and whispered a quiet thank you, not just for the old man, but for his son, the clan, and the lessons of generations that had been shared in that one extraordinary day. Jack knew he would return to his work, to his cattle, and to his life. But he would carry the experience with him always, a reminder that strength is measured not only in courage, but in respect, patience, and understanding. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Jack felt a sense of peace he had not known before. The lessons of the land, of Red Hawk, and of his family, had become a part of him. He knew that any future challenges he faced would be met not just with skill and confidence, but with the wisdom and humility he had learned from the Apache lessons that were far more valuable than any victory gained through force or confrontation. The plains were quiet now, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Jack guided his horse gently, feeling the rhythm of its steps, the cool breeze against his face, and the stillness of the land around him. He had faced a challenge, learned a profound lesson, and found a deeper understanding of life itself. And as he rode into the night, he knew that he had been forever changed by an 5-year-old Apache, his son, and the clan that had arrived not to fight, but to teach. The story of that day, Jack realized, would live with him forever. A true story of courage, respect, and the enduring power of wisdom passed down through generations.